Previously on Homeward Bound.
Here in the middle of the Songs of Ascent, Psalms 127 and 128 in the middle do not sound like the other 13. Although by pointing out the things that are most important, it sheds light that much more on the things we surround ourselves with that are not that important after all. So if we are reading Psalms 120 through 134 as one big epic song about us exiles longing for home and walking towards the new creation, then these two in the middle, Psalms 127 and 128, are the bridge, the interlude of blessing that gives thanks to God, but also sees each other and our children and our children's children as the most important of all. You ever look back on something 10 years after that you thought you couldn't live without and realize that it wasn't that important after all? Could this pandemic of 2020 wind up teaching us something? Mark Twain is said to have said something to the effect, "Most people are bothered by those parts of the Bible they don't understand, but me? I'm bothered by the parts I do understand." Psalms 127 and 128 have some parts that are hard to understand, even hard to translate. But then there are lines that are pretty straightforward, like, "Blessed are all who fear the Lord, who walk in obedience to Him." These two psalms are covered with the language of blessing. And do you know what you do when you're offered a blessing? We graciously receive it. We just say yes to God. The original recipient of Psalms 127, 128 seems to be an everyman kind of character. But the words spoken to and about the man sound more like wisdom literature, like Proverbs and Ecclesiastes. These are not laws that God is laying down. These are sayings meant for blessing. These are blessings of hope for the present and future of God's people. Unlike the Psalms that come before them or after them in the collection of Psalms 120 through 134 that we are reading in our Homeward Bound series, these two Psalms in the middle just hit the pause button and say, receive the blessings of God. Just say yes to the blessings of God. Now we might object, but God, I don't like this. I don't like it out in the desert. I don't like lockdowns and quarantines and masks and hand sanitizer. So these two Psalms take a break for a moment and say, receive this blessing from God. And it is all good news. Each person, man, woman, child, anyone who walks in obedience to God is a person of blessing. This doesn't mean that you never mess up. And it also doesn't mean that everyone gets everything you want. It means that when you wake up every morning,
You start walking in obedience to God.
and for the original singers of these songs, it was a critical time in the history of God's people to sing these two songs. Because at least the way we are imagining these songs of ascent unfolding in our hearing, right about now in the story is when they are no longer in Babylon, Persia, but they are still a long way from home. They are out in the desert, just like their ancestors were between Egypt and the Promised Land. And do you remember what those ancestors did? They complained. They grumbled. You ever been around someone who just complains all the time? Sometimes you just want to say, would you just stop it? But wait, they object. I'm sorry to be complaining all the time, but we are out here in this desert in the middle of nowhere, and we can't find our way home. The funny thing is, that's what's happening in many of the songs of ascent. But not these two. not Psalms 127, 128. They are like an intermission about halfway through the collection that just takes a break for a minute and says, hey, you, yes, you there listening right now, here's a reminder. Unless the Lord builds your life, your labor is in vain. So let God lead you. And as you do, simply walk in obedience to the Lord. And as you walk, you will eat the fruit of your labor. Your children will be like olive shoots. Children are a heritage from the Lord.
But what about the question from last week? Could this pandemic of 2020 wind up teaching us something? Could this period in our lives be challenging us to evaluate what is actually important in our life with God, much less our lives here on earth? Other than coming out here to film these 2 sermons, I'm not in the car that much or on my bike. We don't go out to eat anymore. I don't want to get on an airplane. I wouldn't go to a concert. And then what about us as a church? What does it mean to be a church at a time like this when it's not good for us to gather? Someone from another church said very judgmentally of us, you're just living in fear. Well, yeah, of course. I mean, fear is right. You're using the word fear like anxiety, but fear is the proper response during this time. Because you know what fear is? It's not anxiety, that is, worrying about something that might happen. Legitimate fear is when you have a deadly tiger in your face and you look at the tiger and you feel fear. This whole coronavirus thing is a legitimate threat to the lives of those we love, and we need to take it seriously, which we are. But because this pandemic is a threat to those we love, Psalms 127 and 128 highlight that much more what is most important: each other. Those that the Lord builds is the house of men and women, our children, our children's children, our mothers and fathers, our dear, dear, dear loved ones whom we love just as Jesus teaches us to do. I mean, the reason that the whole worldwide conversation that is saying out loud right now that yes, indeed, Black lives do matter is because they are our mothers and fathers. They have children and children's children who love them. This pandemic is not the only thing that is a threat to those we love during these biblical times. We are learning in all sorts of ways these days what is most important. And we are learning that unless the Lord builds the house, we labor in vain. Our work is meaningless unless the Lord builds the house. These are all the same things God was trying to teach the people in the wilderness way back when they hightailed it out of Egypt, that God would take care of them. When they were trying to get out of Egypt, God warned Pharaoh in Exodus 8 that if he didn't let the people go, God would rain down frogs on them. I mean, imagine if you were minding your own business one evening and all of a sudden it started raining frogs. But I think that's just the thing. If it started raining frogs, given everything else we've seen and experienced the past few years, would it be that much of a surprise? God was setting them free because they were not only in slavery in Egypt, they were in slavery, as we would find out, to their own lifestyles that they realized were not that important after all. Same thing happened later when God sent Hosea and Amos before all this Assyrian, Babylonian, Persian exile business even got started. And sadly, they had gone back into the same old Egypt habits.
worldliness and idolatry, when God was just trying to tell them to love God and love one another. That's it. And I know it makes some people uncomfortable to talk about fearing God, but again, think of the tiger. Not in the sense that if God gets riled up, we're all going to get killed. Rather, it is the opposite of the flippant approach to God and our faith, that God is right in front of us. And our response is not to acknowledge God, who offers blessing. Blessed are those who fear the Lord is a way of describing those of us who keep our minds and hearts on God at all times. So probably the way we need to think of it instead is, blessed are those who remember that God is always with us, because God is the one leading us home. God is the one who will rebuild the house. God is the one who will restore us, set us free, and save us. But the thing is, whether Jesus is talking, Hosea is talking, or Moses is talking, God takes a long time to save the people, because it takes a long time for us to get it. In Exodus 18, Moses has taken on all the responsibility out in the desert, and so his father-in-law Jethro basically says, pace yourself, man, because it's going to be a long trip. This is going to be a long trip. Even after they got back from exile and rebuilt the temple and finished singing these songs, Malachi preached his word in chapter 3 and told them that the messenger would be coming to prepare the way. But he said that about 400 years before Jesus was born. This is going to be a long trip. When I planned this series, I thought we were going to be apart for the first part of it, and that we would get to finish the Songs of Ascent all together, back at Bering. But that may not be the case. We can try to hurry things along, but it doesn't work. Same with our walk with God. We can try to hurry God along, but unless the Lord builds the house. This is for us. Just as it was for the people coming home from Persia, just as it was for the old original exiles. The people had to get Egypt out of their systems before they could go into the promised land, and that's not an easy thing to do when Egypt was all you knew, or what eventually happened, when the desert was all they knew. Jesus dealt with the same thing with the people of Israel, who had become far too comfortable with Rome. In fact, when pushed, Jesus simply told them that they should give Caesar back whatever he asks for, as long as they were Caesar things. Just remember to give God back the things that last, what we are supposed to love God with, namely our hearts, souls, minds, the really important things. None of those all over the place press conferences about how to respond to the pandemic have any impact on whether we can still communicate with each other or care for each other as a church, even from a distance, or love God with all of our hearts. If this time in exile has taught us anything, at least it has reminded us that the church is the people, us, those who walk in obedience to God. Because if we were to go back to the building later today, unless the Lord builds the house, all of our labor is in vain. You have heard both verse 1s of Psalms 127 and 128 now, but hear them again. Unless the Lord builds the house, the builders labor in vain. Unless the Lord watches over the city, the guards stand watch in vain. Blessed are all who fear the Lord, who walk in obedience to Him. Unless the Lord is just another way of saying, Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Walking in obedience to the Lord is to say, Thy will be done. It is not to worry about tomorrow. In fact, remember, right after Jesus taught us to pray in Matthew 6, Jesus also taught us not to worry, not about tomorrow or what we eat or drink or wear.
In vain, we get up early and go to bed late, working for what we eat or drink or wear. Psalms 127 and 128 hope today for the prosperity of tomorrow, because what the people knew then is kind of what we know today. Everything has changed. Everything is different. We have so much disorientation, so much uncertainty. Everything feels like this great big dangerous holding pattern where everyone is constantly tense and sometimes just downright hateful. But that's not true, because it's not everyone. Sometimes it feels that way, but it's not. The fruit of our labor is not in vain when we share it with one another, our families, whether in exile, walking home, or back home and everything is perfectly normal. This blessing never changes, for we are always connected to one another. I think somewhere between the American frontier and 2020, we lost sight of that. Catherine Lee Bates originally wrote what would come to be known as the song America the Beautiful as a poem she wrote while she was on Pikes Peak in Colorado. She was so taken by the things she saw that it changed her way of seeing God's creation. But it wasn't just amber waves of grain. What the song became eventually was a church song about we, the people, all in this together, which is what we need now, more than when the song got popular 100 years ago. If we are going to open our hands and receive God's blessing for our future and for our peace, we probably ought to ask God's help as we all listen to one another. Makes sense during our year of listening, because we can talk issues until we are all red, blue, and purple in the face. But unless we talk to each other and listen to each other and care for one another and value one another, all of our labor is in vain. So, what are we supposed to do out here in the desert? Same thing we would do if we were walking through amber waves of grain or standing on top of a purple mountain in all of its majesty. What do? The answer is simple. We walk. We walk in obedience to God. It is hard to picture the purple mountain's majesty above the fruited plain when all you've ever known is the desert. What if you were born in exile, away from your homeland, and then spent your formative years wandering out in the desert, listening to your parents and grandparents talking about how good it used to be? Because when we grow up like that, we miss the beauty of God's presence right here before us, even today, out in the desert. But even if we were to arrive home tomorrow, unless the Lord builds the house, all of our labor is in vain. And so we walk in obedience, singing to the Lord and to one another all of our days. May the Lord bless you, whether in the city, in the desert, or somewhere in between. Amen.